Jerry Drake is the director of the Division of Archives and Records at the Texas General Land Office, and he is an archaeologist of archives as well as of ships. And he will be sharing with us the Ship of Tides, searching for the wreck of one of those ships that John Jordan just talked about, the Moctezuma. Jerry Drake.
Good morning. I'm passing around a synopsis of the talk that I'm going to be giving. Some of the things that are in that more detailed report there are going to be glossed over. If you're interested in the size of this ship and how many timbers are visible in the waterline and things like that, you'll want to pick up a copy of this little synopsis that I have floating around, because I'm going to gloss over a lot of that in this talk and talk about more big picture things that relate to this wreck and hopefully an attempt to conserve it. The story that I'm going to tell you doesn't have an ending yet, and we are very much at a point in time where it could have a very unhappy ending. So I hope that this presentation will serve as a means of kickstarting some interest in this ship and in this mystery and trying to achieve a solution to it. I want to thank you all very much for having me here to talk about my passion. I am an archivist by profession, but an archaeologist by passion. Well, what does that mean? I have academic training and field training in archaeology, but I've never used archaeology to make a living. Whenever I was a student, we used to have a joke: how is an archaeologist like a medium pizza? Anybody know? Neither one will feed a family of 4. So this talk is warmly dedicated to my wife. I can promise that I will continue to clear out our bank account on a yearly basis to drive all over the world searching for ships in lost cities and things like that, because it is my passion, and I appreciate y'all allowing me to come here and talk about something that's so close to my heart. Not only is it the Texas Navy, it's also a chance to practice some really exciting historical research at the edge of our understanding of what went on during the Texas Revolution. See if I can figure out how to use this thing. First off, let me begin with a little disclaimer that I promised the very fine folks at the Texas Historical Commission I would include here. Shipwrecks found on the tide line or on the beach of Texas are owned by the state of Texas, and they are under the jurisdiction of the Texas Historical Commission. If you go out and start digging on them without a permit, without a license, without paying a bunch of money, you are committing a crime. So if you ever happen to wander across something of historical significance you see on the beaches of Texas, leave it alone. It is actually against the law to tamper with these things. All of the research that's been done on this ship so far by myself has been non-invasive. It's merely an attempt to take measurements and to take a look at the historic significance of the wreck and its possible significance in terms of our understanding of the Revolution. The Texas Historical Commission has done a preliminary evaluation of this wreck. They do have a site file on it, but in order to keep people from going out and continuing the process of looting this wreck, it has been looted rather severely. I'm not going to make any reference to the site number for this wreck or its exact location during this talk. So that's my disclaimer on that. Before we begin, John just did a really good job of telling us the narrative of the Texas Navy and the contribution it made during the Texas Revolution. One thing that I should point out, Texas really had 2 navies. After the war ended, we had a more official navy that was under the command of a young United States naval officer named Commodore Moore. He was actually Post Captain Moore. We had a second navy that was built up under Mirabou B. Lamar. What we're talking about today is the first Navy of Texas, more or less commanded by Post Captain Hawkins, and specifically an engagement that took place under the command of Jeremiah Brown, who was captain of the ship Invincible. Jeremiah Brown was an interesting character, kind of an oddball guy, and he really was a Navy unto himself. He had orders from the Convention of Texas that were issued whenever we were in convention in March. And his orders were to go out on the high seas and engage, sink, destroy, capture the Montezuma, or the Moctezuma, which is the actual name of the ship, which was prowling up and down the coast as a means of bringing the war to Texas in a naval fashion. One question that people always want to know is, why do we study the Texas Navy? Why is it important? I always remember that line from that song in John Wayne's Alamo movie, "They fought to give us freedom, that's all we need to know." The point is, it's not all we need to know. The Texas Revolution was an international conflict, virtually global in scope, in terms of the people that were involved, the nations that were involved, and the interest that was channeled toward it. I like to refer to the Texas Revolution as the Third American Revolution. Why? The Revolution of 1776 gave us the promise of American independence. The War of 1812 solidified American independence, and the Texas Revolution provided the real estate to make possible a coast-to-coast Atlantic to Pacific empire for the United States. If Texas remained a part of Mexico, would we be driving a superhighway all the way up into Montana to get to San Francisco today? I don't think so. Beginning with Vice President Aaron Burr's attempt to filibuster Texas in the early 1800s, leading right up until the Revolution of 1836, businessmen in places like Mississippi and New Orleans were continually attempting to filibuster Texas into the United States. The Revolution was a completion of that project. Many of the people who were involved in Burr's early attempt to get Texas were, for instance, his pallbearers when he died in 1836, a guy named Swartout. William Christie of New Orleans, one of the financiers of the Texas Revolution, had himself been tried for attempting to yank Texas out of Mexico and filibustered into the United States. And one of the fellows who died at the Alamo, last name Despalier, his father was a member of the McGee-Gutierrez expedition that camped up in East Texas for a long time. The Navy is important because it provides us a glimpse into the money and the politics that were taking place in places like New York, London, Paris, and New Orleans that were all converging on Texas to make Texas independent and thus a part of the United States. When we talk about Jeremiah Brown sailing his ship under an American flag, a lot of people, the temptation is to say that Jeremiah Brown was disguised as an American. I believe that Jeremiah Brown was sailing as an American. Evidence seems to indicate that these men bought American naval uniforms, or they kept their British and American naval uniforms when they entered the Texas Navy. They flew the burgees of the American Navy, and they behaved on the high seas as American ships of war. Why would you do that? Well, it was tremendously beneficial for your enemy to think that you had a massive nation backing you up rather than little bitty independent Texas. So it was a political weapon. When we adopted a flag for the Texas Navy, the flag that was adopted was the commercial flag being used by the company of McKinney and Williams, who owned a shipping company. The only difference between that flag and the United States flag is that instead of X number of stars over in the corner, there was one large white lone star. From a distance, that flag would be seen on the horizon as an American naval flag. So these guys were very much engaged in politics. One author referred to them as the shirt-sleeve diplomats of Texas. Once the Texas Revolution ends in 1836, the war for the Navy does not end until the end of the Mexican War. They continue to engage the enemy right up until we become a part of the United States. So it very much changes our understanding of how Texas achieved its independence and how Texas became a state of the Union. That's why I think it's important for us to continue to look at these battles and to continue to look at the truth that lies beneath them. Now, what I want to talk about after I've done my spiel there is a specific engagement which took place on April 3rd of 1836. The picture that you're looking at there is the wreck of a schooner. We know that it's a schooner from looking at the mast positions. All the way in the back, that large octagonal-looking object in the picture is the mainmast of this ship. The second thing that you see there sticking up out of the water is what's called a spanker mast. And the front is some kind of harness to do rigging onto that spanker mast. It's a two-masted ship. It's about 80 feet long, about 21 feet wide. So it is, by all intents and purposes, a schooner of war. And it is situated in the tide line, as you can see from that picture, between the dunes and the ocean on Boca Chica Island. And it is so close to the mouth of the Rio Grande, you can practically see the Rio Grande from where you're at down there. I'd say probably 100 people a year are actually intrepid enough to get down to this spot. But in 1836, it was a freeway. I mean, there was an encampment at Matamoros. Santana's army was building up about 1,000 troops in Matamoros. The last battle of the Civil War, for instance, took place within eyeshot of this at Palmetto Ranch on the mainland. This place was very heavily trafficked in those days. Today, it's not good for much more than just fishing. So fortunately, this thing is kind of off the beaten path. Unfortunately, its location down in the middle of nowhere also has kept it out of the headlines and kept people from being interested in it. This is a more close-up view of the bowsprit, the front of the ship. So it looks like what we're actually looking at is the remains of the ship from the waterline all the way down to the main bow that would be the part that actually carried the ship through the water. And this is an image of some of the ribs of the ship as they come off the bowsprit behind that forward mast, that spanker mast. And this is what the ship looks like, I guess, at about mid-tide in the middle of the day. You can see that a little bit of the ribbing is visible for the most part. Whenever we visited this thing the first time, you could barely make it out in the water, but it is clearly there. And that's some of the ribs on the dune side. You can just see a few pieces of wood sticking up out of the sand there. And let's tell the story of how we think this may have gotten here. This is a map of the area around Matamoros. It's a U.S. government map made by a guy named J.J. Albert. If you ever want to get a copy of the original, it's over at the Texas State Library. That red line up there indicates magnetic north, and the map is from 1847. This is about the closest detail we can get of Boca Chica from that time period, roughly 11 years after the battle actually took place. If you take a look over there on the left-hand side, or on the right-hand side, you can see Padre Island. Separating Boca Chica Island and Padre Island is a little inlet called Brazos de Santiago. And what that area is basically the gateway into the Great Laguna Madre, the area of calm seas down in that part of Texas. Remember, Santana was massing troops at Matamoros, and there were a couple of ships that were placed on the outside of the barrier islands to patrol, to keep an eye out for British, American, and Texan vessels that could propose harm to the massed troops there at Matamoros. On April the 3rd, Jeremiah Brown approached the mouth of the Rio Grande in his Invincible, and he sighted two ships. Now remember, at this time he's sailing under orders to seek out and engage the Moctezuma. The Moctezuma was a very, very old ship, and for a long time it was the only ship in the Mexican Navy. Under the Spanish and under the early part of Santana's reign, he fancied himself the Napoleon of the West. It would have been better if he had fancied himself the Wellington of the West, because much like Napoleon, he didn't understand how to use a navy, and the navy had dwindled. A much more intelligent military tactician, Jose Maria Tornel, had been building up their navy, beginning with some ships that were purchased. But they didn't have a lot of seasoned naval officers in the Mexican Navy, so they tended to hire out former American commanders and former British commanders to serve in the Mexican Navy. Now that might seem odd to us today, that you would have such fluid allegiance to a country, but in reality, in those days, professional soldiering was a career, it was a job. A lot of people don't realize that famous naval captains often sailed for many different countries. For instance, our own John Paul Jones ended his career sailing for the Russian Navy because there simply weren't enough ships and enough men in times of peace to maintain a full navy, and a sailor by sailor is a sailor by nature, so they tended to get jobs where they could get them. A lot of the guys that were captaining these ships from Mexico, like Thomas N. Thompson, better known as Mexico Thompson, were people who had learned their craft in America, in the United States. So Jeremiah Brown cruises down the coast, and he sights near the mouth of the Rio Grande two ships, the Segundo Correo de Mexico and the General Bravo. General Bravo has lost its rudder, and they are in the process of effecting repairs to the tail of that ship. Now, this is where things become a little confusing. Jeremiah Brown pulls up alongside General Bravo. You can almost imagine them yelling stuff back and forth. These ships, we're not talking about things much bigger than modern-day yachts. In fact, modern-day yachts are based on schooner technology. And he passes himself off as an American. And he says, man, I'm mad. We've got an American consul general in Matamoros who's been told to keep his mouth shut, and that guy's angry, and we want to know what's going on. And he sends a guy named William Leving in a longboat across from the Invincible to the General Bravo. And they talk for a little bit, and we're not sure exactly what set things off. It's possible that the commander of the General Bravo, a guy named Fernando Davis, Segundo Teniente Marina Fernando Davis, let slip his line and started allowing his ship to drip back towards the mouth of the Rio Grande in safety. We don't know for sure what set him off, but Jeremiah Brown turns loose shot at General Bravo, and a naval engagement of the kind John described began to unfold. Poor old Leving gets stuck on General Bravo, and out of anger is later executed as a spy on April the 6th. They fight for a little while, and eventually Jeremiah Brown sights another sail out on the horizon and turns his ship away from the engagement and sails towards that other ship. That other ship turns out to be the American brigantine Pocket, which is carrying those supplies and is also carrying some contrabando Mexican officials who go on to get themselves in really big trouble. The interesting thing about researching or sleuthing this naval battle is the poverty of sources that we have to work with. One thing that I should point out is that naval servicemen who served in the Navy of Texas were not given land grants for their military service. Why is that important? Well, most of the guys who fought in the Army received land for their service, and as a result of that, there's a paper trail of documentation that relates to who they are. We can track down their biographies, we can build up muster rolls of who they were. In some cases, we have letters and additional documentation related to their lives. These naval soldiers, who a lot of them came from Britain, from the United States, and even from Central and South America, we don't really know that much about them. There's a few diaries that still exist, but there's not the level of documentation we have for the soldiers who fought on the ground, because as all they received was a paycheck in redbacks for their military service. They had no incentive to stick around and hang around in Texas and tell their story to the newspapers 50 years later, like people like William Zuber did on down the road. So we don't have a lot of sources that still exist. What we basically have are a handful of newspaper accounts written in Matamoros and published in New Orleans, and some official, basically activity logs of what occurred in the Mexican records down in Mexico City. Well, according to the newspaper accounts in Matamoros, we find that this ship, General Bravo, was in fact the Moctezuma, renamed, rechristened, under a new name, put into service at Matamoros, and that Jeremiah Brown overwhelmingly defeated the Mexican naval vessel, drove them into the sand, the ship burned to the tide line, it was completely destroyed. Overwhelming victory for the Texas Navy. The Mexican sources report the exact opposite, that the Mexican Navy overwhelmingly defeated Jeremiah Brown, drove him out to sea, and it was a glorious victory for the Mexican Navy. We do know that both ships sustained damage. Whenever Jeremiah Brown finally gets back to New Orleans aboard the Invincible, he has to effect repairs to his ship, so obviously he had taken some damage. And we don't know what happened to General Bravo / Moctezuma. Moctezuma had had an earlier military engagement in 1835 with the U.S. revenue cutter Ingham, which later becomes a ship in the Texas Navy. From that point on, it disappears from the historic record until the Matamoros correspondence to the New Orleans newspapers report that it had been named General Bravo. That was not tradition for the Mexican Navy. In fact, typically when Mexican Navy ships were renamed, they were given the name Segundo and then the name of the ship they originally were before. But in this case, it was named General Bravo. He was an important character in the Mexican Army, and so you can imagine that perhaps this ship was named after him as a tribute. The Mexican Navy had ships like Vencedor de Alamo, the Victory, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, the Victor of the Alamo. They had one called a Santa Ana. So they were naming their ships that Tornell was buying after important things that were happening right at the time the Texas Revolution was taking place. So that's a plausible story. We also have another ship in the area called the Segundo Carrillo de Mexico, the second Carrillo de Mexico, because the earlier one had been either damaged or taken out of service earlier on. But for all intents and purposes, after this battle, the Moctezuma disappears from the historical record. The General Bravo continues to be referred to, but now mostly with the appellation Segundo General Bravo. So what does that tell us? That perhaps Moctezuma / General Bravo is sitting on a beach on Boca Chica Island, and Tornell simply names the next ships that he produces after the one that he's lost. We don't know what happened. The only answer to this problem lies within the archaeological record. The ship on a beach on Boca Chica Island, which is slowly eroding into nothing. The best analogy I can use is, say the real estate developers who wanted to demolish the Alamo and build a hotel had gotten their way, and it's now 2006, and we're taking a look at the real estate in downtown, and we find the foundations of the Alamo and decide to launch an archaeological excavation to understand what happened on March 6th of 1836. That's where we sit with this ship on the tide line on Boca Chica Island. We don't know what happened. We've amassed all the documents we can get together, and the only thing that's keeping us from solving this mystery is a lack of interest and a lack of money. The Texas Historical Commission does not have the funds to engage in the type of excavation they need to engage in to preserve this wreck. You can dig it up, that doesn't cost anything, but the instant you start digging it up, it's going to begin to deteriorate. We always hear stories about shipwrecks that are dug up and then they go off to some secret laboratory and then they sit in water for 10 years and they reappear. That's what's happening here now, is that this thing has been exposed to the elements and exposed to looting, and it's starting to deteriorate. Without some kind of laboratory conservation, we're only one more Rita away from losing this thing forever and from never being able to solve the mystery of what happened on April the 3rd of 1836. Those photographs which I showed you earlier are pictures of the wreck as they appeared in 2005. This is what it looks like following Hurricane Rita. Look how much more of it has now been exposed, and look at the condition of the wood timber just a year later. It's already starting to rot above the waterline, and tantalizingly, a lot more of the ship has become visible, which gives us a few more clues as to what was going on. This is a picture of those ribs that you saw buried almost completely under the sand. A year later, they've become totally visible. And see all that green stuff? See how much of the wreck has started to deteriorate as the beach has eroded. We are definitely in serious danger of losing this thing. This is the all-important part of the ship that's going to answer our questions about whether or not this is the ship that was engaged in that battle. The rear. This is where the rudder would actually join the ship, and it's almost eroded enough to see what was going on. This is the part of the ship that would tell us whether or not this is a vessel that had sustained damage to its rudder and then was pushed ashore as a result of a battle. I haven't been out there in a while, and as soon as we can get out there, hopefully sometime this summer, maybe this will tell us a little bit more about what was going on. But let me draw your attention to the amount of moss that's growing on that woodwork. That moss is feeding on this ship, and eventually it's going to deteriorate what little is left of it. Now I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of websites. I hope you'll get interested in this wreck. You can check my website. It's hysterical.org. I'm going to be keeping postings on this. Yeah. Don't forget it. You can keep up to date with what we're doing, and eventually the papers that I'm going to publish on this will be posted up there in draft form. And I'm also keeping a running dialogue of what's going on with this ship at the Texas Navy's website at texasnavy.com. The important thing to remember about this is that it's, as I said at the beginning, this is a story without an ending. If we can raise a little bit of money and get some people interested in this, there are archaeologists that will take the job. We can get a permit cleared to do this excavation. We can save perhaps the only ship that still exists that was sunk during the Texas Revolution by Texas revolutionaries. Try to put that into perspective. If this was a land-based battle site, how would you feel if somebody was fixing to demolish it and build a parking lot? You'd be pretty mad. But what we're talking about here is fighting the elements, fighting people with metal detectors, and basically fighting apathy. And we are in a position to answer these questions and to solve this mystery if we just have a little bit of interest. So I thank you very much for your time and for letting me talk about this. And again, if you want to keep up to date, check out those websites. We'll be keeping you in the loop there. Thank you.